Hello, I'm Verity Cowper. Welcome to our first edition of Inside COP15 Live. We're coming to you from our studio in Copenhagen, and we'll be here every night for the next fortnight, so you can tune in and speak to a variety of guests who'll be giving you information from one of the most important conferences ever. It's the opening day of the Climate Summit, so as yet we're not really sure which way the wind is blowing, but I'm joined today by some guests who can give us information from the talks on the Bella Centre and activities going on elsewhere in the city. Today, we're joined by Tasneem Essop from WWF, Martin Sommerkorn from WWF, and also artist Mark Coreth. So, Tasneem, first of all, you're obviously from WWF South Africa, and we've already heard an announcement from South Africa that they're prepared to cut emissions, which is obviously a really historical announcement. What do you think this means for developing countries and reducing their emissions?
Well, it was a big announcement for South Africa. And it comes off the back of a number of other announcements by big developing countries like Brazil, China, India. South Africa announcing it just ahead of the COP was really good. It does show the world that developing countries, especially the major developing countries, are serious about contributing towards the global effort to reduce emission reductions. So I think it's a good start to the COP. We, of course, have heard that the South Africans said that they can do this if there is a good, strong and comprehensive outcome in Copenhagen. So they're depending on a very ambitious outcome, and the agreement has to also deal with issues of finance so that we can enhance and strengthen the kind of work we would like to do in South Africa. So I think it's a good start to the COP. It's been a good first day for the developing countries.
And as you mentioned just then, it depends on finance. So there's obviously sort of some conditions involved with the pledge that has been made. What sort of conditions are those, and do you think that's going to go forward?
Well, look, part of the announcement deals with what they can do domestically with domestic funding, but a large part of strengthening that ambition will rely on international funding. And this is in line with what, in any case, the United Nations Framework Convention says, that developing countries should be putting forward actions that they can take, but it would be dependent on financial support from the developed countries. And so in line with that, I think all of the developing countries can do much more if it does come with technological support and financial support.
I mean, South Africa in particular has been obviously suffering from blackouts recently, and there's a lot of coal-fired power stations there, obviously, which are needed to deal with these blackouts. I mean, how do you think you can overcome that with renewable energy? Is that possible? Will you have enough finance for that?
Well, that's exactly the issue. I think that we can shift away from this dependence we have in South Africa on cheap electricity and cheap coal-based electricity by moving towards renewables, but that comes at a cost. So there's been a very serious move in energy policy in the country to prioritize renewable energy, but that is not easy, and it's not easy to fund that with our domestic budgets. You need to understand South Africa does have development challenges. I mean, we are poor, we have high levels of poverty and high levels of unemployment. We come out of a particular history in South Africa, and we're still dealing with that history. So to deal with all of those priorities and then to make sure that the kind of development we have is in fact going to take us in, on a path of sustainable development, that we're not going to increase our emissions, but we will limit it. That's a big challenge. So that makes this announcement particularly ambitious. And I think that the South African announcement is one of the most ambitious so far, because it has dealt with the real emission reductions and deviation from our normal business as usual scenario in the country.
I mean, I think it is one of the really big pledges, and actually you've already been called one of the stars of the negotiations, South Africa.
Oh.
So, I mean, events like this have sort of in the past often been about the Northern Hemisphere. Do you think that the Southern Hemisphere are going to have a voice in the negotiations?
Well, I think very importantly in this round, it's clear that what the developing countries are putting on the table, and it's been looked at in terms of the numbers, the total collective contribution of what they've offered so far, Brazil, India, China and others, would in fact be far more in terms of gigatons of carbon than what the industrialized countries have put on the table thus far, which is worrying, because we would have expected the leadership to be coming from the historical emitters, as the convention asks us. So we're very excited that the developing countries have provided leadership, and we're hoping that this will now spark a race to the top for industrialized nations to also come with far more ambition on their reduction targets and as well as their financial support.
Excellent, thank you very much. So moving on to you, Martin, you're obviously coming from completely the other side of the planet, the Arctic. You've been working in the Arctic tent, which is obviously one of the events going on in the city rather than sort of part of the talks in the Bella Centre.
Yes.
So, you know, where was your interest in the Arctic and what's been going on there?
Well, the first thing to really say is that while I was working on Arctic issues and am working on Arctic issues, it's really not all about the Arctic, because what we have been communicating before this COP was mostly that the changes in the Arctic mean something to the world. So it's actually really funny if you think about it, that every time you talk about climate change, somebody wants to talk to you about climate change, you see ice melting of some sort. Now, show me an iceberg, I know you want to talk to me about climate change.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what we have been trying to do was really to tell the world what it means that the ice is melting. And that is actually really interesting to know, that hardly anybody knows what it means to the world that the ice is melting. Now, and that is happening on several fronts. One thing is, of course, that the melting of ice in the Arctic means global change globally will be much more severe than we have seen it in the scenarios, but it will also be more severe for all people on the planet. I'm talking about sea level rise, I'm talking about even added concentration of greenhouse gases. I have opened the tent yesterday with a science day. We had Arctic high-level scientists that were telling the world basically what all that means. And I opened the day by saying, nature does not negotiate. We are negotiating the solutions. But we can only do this on facts, based on facts. And only knowing that the ice is melting doesn't really show us yet what that all means and what the facts really are. So there is another dimension. We are showcasing in this Arctic tent what it means to the people and all groups and peoples in the Arctic and how they feel about it. We are going to showcase the Arctic and all its varieties to see not only what it means to the world, but it also sees what it means to the people there.
So how are you actually sort of representing visually for people what the ice melting means?
The ice melting means for you 1 meter or more of sea level rise by the end of this century, and it doesn't stop there. It means 1/4 of the world's population to be at risk of all the consequences of that sea level rise. Saltwater inundation, flooding of access to resources, climate refugees, economical upheaval, and all together. There will be, I'm using images of these impacts to be not only the ice, but to be at your doorsteps. The polar bear coming to you, basically knocking at your back door. That is what is really happening. And I think it is really valuable to now see and listen to the science that brings across our increasing understanding and ever more increasing understanding of the feedbacks, the consequences of the impacts, because those are not yet in everybody's mind, and they're especially not in the mind of those who are negotiating all the time.
Speaking of the of polar bears, one of the highlights of the Arctic tent has been the ice bear sculpture, which is outside, and that's obviously something you've worked on, Mark. So, I mean, can you tell me a bit about the sculpture, how it came about, how you sort of partnered with WWF and what you're demonstrating?
Certainly. I sculpt around the world. I was born and bred in Kenya, East Africa, but I've always had a huge longing to investigate the north. I'd like to go into that environment and really learn the environment. As a wildlife sculptor, you can't divorce wildlife from people, you can't divorce wildlife from people or the environment. It's really almost like using sculpture as a language. You try and get in there and learn about it. You travel with the local people. From them, you just get a minefield of the most incredible knowledge. And so I wanted to go and look for polar bear, yes. So I went up to Pond Inlet and then onto the ice this May, early May, with skidoos, Comedex, and Inuit guides. The more I got involved, the more I spoke to them with a sort of background knowledge of what was happening, the more you realise that things are changing, and it's just not right.